Hello everybody, my name is Chris Shilling and I'm a Professor of Sociology at SSP SSR. Now, sociology, expressed at its most basic, is to do with the study of society. And this generally entails looking at those trends, developments, processes and events that extend beyond the horizons of individuals, but which nevertheless affect them. They affect them in terms of their thoughts, their feelings, their actions and their plans. In this context, it might seem a little bit strange that one of the fastest growing subjects of interest in the discipline over the last 30 years has been to do with the body and human embodiment. Why is this seen as odd? Well, for many, the body is something which is not social or public, but private. And indeed, it's something which for many is best studied by the biological and physiological sciences. In one respect, however, it's not that surprising that the body's become so much of an interest in the social sciences. Social developments themselves have raised the profile of the body in a number of different ways. One of the most obvious is the way that we are surrounded in consumer culture by images of trim and taut, of slim and sexy bodies. They're in social media, they stare down on us from billboards, they're covering television and film advertising. They do that because bodies sell. Not everybody, it's particular youthful bodies that sell, but nevertheless, that's one way in which they've come to sociological attention. Relatedly, much interest has been displayed in people's continuing attempts to pursue images of the body beautiful. In America alone in 2014, there were 15.6 million cosmetic surgery operations embarked upon by people seeking to improve their appearance. The obsession with body matters has also been raised by certain serious social problems. The media talks about an increase in anorexia, especially among young women, and there's been a new term coined, muscle dysmorphia, to refer to those young men who spend so much time in the gym with supplements, with steroids, in the pursuit of a hyper-masculine and muscular body. Again, the body is important there. But if social developments are focused on the body, unresolved issues in our understanding of society have also stimulated this sociological interest. And I want to start here with the issue of social structures, those relationships, those norms, those institutions that tend to constrain and shape and steer our actions and our thoughts. If we want to understand how social structures operate, it's no use just looking at ideology as a mental cognitive phenomena which affects our thought processes. We need to understand how structures imprint themselves upon the body. In terms of a penal system, is it concerned with rehabilitation or with punishment, for instance? And what about, in the case of social class, what about those forms of work that people do? We know that there are major inequalities in morbidity and mortality levels when it comes to social class. If we want to understand those, we need to understand how different types of work impact upon stress levels and other elements of people's bodily being. We know, for instance, that night work, working years, night work, has a deleterious effect on the heart. Similarly, people's capacity for agency, for our capacity to intervene in the flow of life around us and make a difference, is absolutely dependent upon our bodily being. At its most basic, we need to realize that the morphology of the body, the shape of the body, our limbs, where our senses are positioned, those senses that we have, is crucial in allowing us to extend ourselves into the environment and recruit it to our plans. If we want to understand our capacities for agency, we also need to look at what's taught at schools. What capacities, what techniques is education involved in encouraging among people? And if we want to understand social class differences and the capacity to make a difference to the world, it's interesting to look at the different ways in which different types of schools equip people with different types of capacities. Body matters are, in fact, crucial to the subject matter of sociology. Social divisions and power relations, for instance, have long been articulated through our bodily being. And racism here is a prominent and important example. Recent studies from America, for instance, have identified a strong correlation between skin color and earnings, with the darker the skin color of a person corresponding to lower earnings. Earlier, in the early decades of the 20th century, we've got another example of this. A pioneer of modern rhinoplasty, Jacques Joseph, helped German Jews avoid persecution by becoming facially, ethnically invisible. Elsewhere, following World War II, Chinese, Korean, Japanese, and Asian Americans embarked upon an increasing amount of double eyelid surgery. Now, scholars often talk about imperialism in their writings about national inequalities and the development of global relations. But it seems to me that if we want to understand the precise mechanisms whereby imperialism works, we need to look at corporeal imperialism, the way in which particular looks, particular colours become elevated as having a great status, to the extent that people will spend money and undertake risks in order to approximate in their appearance to those norms. If the body is key to inequalities, so is it for social solidarities. Early Christians who embarked upon pilgrimages marked their identities and the affinity they felt with other Christians by being tattooed. Now, tattoos are all around us these days. They've become phenomenally popular over the last couple of decades. It's just about impossible to turn on television and look at a football match without seeing various football players' arms and necks emblazoned with tattoos. But historically speaking, tattoos have been a prime marker among prisoners, among various sections of the armed services, for instance, of solidarities and commonalities between people. What we consume, what we eat, what we incorporate into our bodies, and what we exclude from and refuse to take into our bodies is also very important here. The fasting that takes place during Ramadan, for instance, can promote visceral experiences of commonality among Muslims. These examples suggest that the body is, in many respects, our most natural symbol. It is, in fact, often experienced very intensely as a sign and vehicle of identity and belonging. And that belonging can also set one group off from another group. And this is evident, for instance, in contemporary controversies over modes of conventionally Muslim dress in predominantly secular societies. Some of the debates that have been going on in France in recent years are a good example of this. The significance of bodily habits, of techniques and experiences for people's conception of who they are and who they belong to, and indeed of the broader reality of which they are part, should give pause to thought for those who think some form of pure dialogue or communication can resolve differences and conflicts between people. So if there's some of the reasons why the body has become an important issue to sociology and the social sciences, how can that discipline and its cognate disciplines assist us? How can it assist us in understanding them? Many people actually think that classical sociology has little to offer a study of the bodily basis of identity, action and society. But I think that's wrong. And I just want to illustrate that with reference to two key sociologists. First one is Emil Durkheim. His most important book, The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life, had at its centre a theory not only of religion, not only of humanity, not only of society, but actually it had a theory that attached those to a particular bodily basis. It attached them in their creation, their contingency to a bodily basis. So Durkheim recognised that the bodies that we inhabit, are a source of egoistic and selfish drives, wants and needs. But his analysis of that collective effervescence, that strong emotional current that whipped through collective meetings of people assembled in the context of what they perceived to be extraordinary, also argued that the body is the source of the sacred. It's a key source of the sacred, a source which stimulates emotions in people, which take them beyond themselves and which fix them to broader collectivities. And it seems to me that from sporting events to memorial services to protests during the Arab Spring to the French people's collective defiance against the November terrorist attacks of 2015, Durkheim's work remains keenly relevant. But he's not the only one. The German sociologist Max Weber, one of his most important writings was about the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. And what he did there, although he's often interpreted as just focusing on ideas, what he did there was to demonstrate how it was that particular religious ideas and ideals can affect people's habits and actions. For Weber, the Protestants eschewed sinful pleasure, and immerse themselves in long hours of labour searching for worldly signs of election. Those bodily habits and the real-world consequences of them provided a corporeal basis for rational capitalism. If we want to understand historical development, we need to understand modes of embodiment and how they are reformed historically. Having noted how just a couple of classical sociologists have provided visions of social development that incorporates at its centre a concern with the body, I now want to mention just a few of those multiple and diverse factors that have prompted the current gaze on and interrogation of the body. These include, firstly, second-wave feminism. During the 1960s and the 1970s, feminism was extremely powerful in insisting that the body is not a private issue, it's a public political issue, and that issues such as rape, such as the exclusion of women from public space, were important ones which needed to be dealt with on a national, international, political level. Secondly, from a very different basis, rising ecological concerns about the sustainability of the world's resources have also put the camera's focus upon the sustainability of our bodily lifestyles. We live in a consumer culture where consuming as much and as often as possible seems often for many to be a marker of status. Whereas for many people, for an increasing number of people with issues of climate change and global warming, the body and how we live in and consume as embodied beings is key to the future sustainability of this planet. From a very different perspective, so some interesting developments in the 1980s in the field of artificial intelligence also threw the spotlight on the body. Before the mid-1980s, AI often focused on computer science, on programs, but after that time there was an increasing focus on robotics. And one of the key terms of that period was intelligence needs a body. And of course it does. Our thoughts are not confined to a head. They don't just separate us from the rest of the world. Our thoughts are integrally related to bodily receptors and to the way in which we are intentionally positioned within the environment, going about our daily plans. So robotics and intelligence is another interesting factor which has thrown spotlight on the body, whether these are human bodies or mechanically created bodies. Developments in bodily governments in government are also keenly significant in raising the profile of the body, particularly since 9/11. Since that time, as a consequence of the increased use of passports, identity cards, iris, fingerprint and voice recognition devices, our bodies have become our passwords. We are increasingly tracked at borders and elsewhere by means of recognising us. And if people who live in London, on average someone moving through London can appear on CCTV camera several hundred times a day. Elsewhere, as various nation states have sought to reduce their public spending on services such as the health service, we've seen a growing focus on individual citizens being told that we are responsible for our own health. And certainly in this country, it's been very evident. It's been in the news an awful lot lately. Not only now is it impossible just about to smoke without thinking of the harm it's doing to oneself, not only is it the fact that most people will know how many portions of fruit and veg they're meant to eat per day in order to stay healthy. These days we're told that there is no safe level of alcohol consumption. And this emphasis, this encouragement for us to become biological citizens responsible for our own health has reached the stage actually where this morning when I was driving into work, there was a story on the radio about how food producers are being encouraged on their packets to list how much exercise would be needed in order to get rid of the calories that have consumed as a result of eating. Maybe one day health authorities are going to wake up and realise that the ultimate cause of death is life. But in the meantime, we're being told that we've got to become more and more impressive biological citizens. The final factor that I want to mention that's highlighted the significance of the body to society and also to sociology are commodification processes. Now, I mentioned those in relation to adverts and social media early on in this talk. They have a far greater penetration throughout society, though, and they range from the brutal selling of women and children into the sex industry to the global problem of organ trafficking. And while the way in which bodies have become commodified has altered, it depends where you live, depends what social class you are of, depends on your gender or your race. There's all sorts of social variables. Not even the privileged escape that. The body is a valuable vehicle for display. And in Silicon Valley, for instance, plastic surgeons report growing Botox use among male tech workers in their 30s, concerned to maintain the appearance of youth. These days, people are so worried about appearing old or not fit that they might lose their job that they are thinking about cosmetic surgery as a way to seek to embody the ethos and the productivity of the company. Now, these developments that I've mentioned briefly highlight very different aspects of the body, from its gendered dimensions to its robotic, its governmental, or its commodified dimensions. The body, in terms of what we understand about it, slips and slides. It metamorphoses in terms of its meaning and status. And indeed, at a time when scientific and technological developments are allowing us to intervene in the body as never before, to supplement our body with all sorts of other devices, to transplant things into our body, the extent to that's that happened, it means that the body has become increasingly contested. In this context, if we consider Durkheim's work, it's reasonable to consider whether bodies are now prized and even rendered sacred on the basis of varied opposing factors. These include their youth, their ethnicity, their skills and capacities, their value as commodities, and because they adhere or don't adhere to divinely commanded conceptions of religious living. Such variations, however, also highlight potentially deadly conflicts and disagreements. There was a book written a few decades ago by Samuel Huntington that talked about the clash of civilizations. Now, it's been very heavily criticized for simplifying and overgeneralizing the cultural differences between people. Huntington himself thought that this was going to be the clash of cultures, international cultures, was going to be the major problem facing American policy in the 21st century. He's been heavily criticized, but nevertheless, what we are seeing across the globe today, we can see it in terms of the threat posed by ISIS, for instance, are fundamental disagreements and conflicts about how bodies should be managed. This is an important issue, and it's going to be one that carries on through this century. In conclusion, the manner in which bodies are conceptualized, experienced, and treated provides us with more than a topic of interest restricted to the biological sciences. It seems to me that focusing upon the significance of the body as a foundation, albeit a permeable foundation, that is fundamentally affected by social relationships and by the intentional orientation of different individuals, focusing on that is a key means of looking at social change, looking at inequalities, looking at opportunities. It's important. In short, bodies matter. Thank you for listening.